Okay, so imagine this. You're trying to build a toaster from scratch.
From scratch, wow.
Yeah, I mean, like mining the ore yourself, the whole 9 yards.
Okay, that's pretty ambitious. We're talking full-on back to basics.
Exactly. You'd think it'd be simple, right? Bread, heat, what could go wrong? But one guy, a product designer, actually tried this, and it was a complete disaster. The thing basically exploded.
Yikes, I can only imagine. It does make you realize that even simple things can be super complex. And that actually brings us to today's deep dive. We're tackling Tim Harford's Adapt, Why Success Always Starts with Failure.
Such a good book. It's full of stories that really make you think. We've got military strategists, Nobel Prize winners, even choreographers, all showing us how messing up can actually be the key to achieving something amazing.
And what I find so interesting about Harford's approach is that he doesn't just tell these stories. He breaks down the underlying principles, like the science behind why trial and error is so important for progress.
Right. So this deep dive will give you a new perspective on how to approach challenges in your own life. And some great stories, too.
Absolutely. Whether you're leading a team, trying to come up with new ideas for your business, or just figuring out how to live a better life, this deep dive will give you some new tools for your toolkit.
I love that. So let's jump right in. One of the first things Harford tackles is this idea of expertise. We tend to put experts on a pedestal, but he throws a bit of a curveball at us.
Yeah, he really does. He dives into the research of Philip Tetlock, a political scientist who studied the predictions of political pundits. And what he found was kind of funny, to be honest. These so-called experts were often no better at predicting the future than just flipping a coin.
Especially the ones who are constantly on TV, the ones with all the strong opinions and fancy titles.
Exactly. And it's not that these experts weren't smart. It's that the world is so incredibly complex that even the brightest minds can get things wrong, especially when it comes to predicting the future.
So does that mean we should just ignore experts altogether?
Not at all. But Harvard's point is that we need to be more critical of expertise. We need to understand its limitations and be aware of the biases that can creep in.
He gives this great example from the business world. He looks at In Search of Excellence, a classic management book that identified companies that were crushing it back in the 80s. But then a lot of those excellent companies kind of went downhill.
Yeah, it's almost like they got stuck in their ways. They were successful doing things a certain way, and then the world changed. But they didn't adapt.
It's like that saying, what got you here won't get you there. So if expertise isn't enough, what is?
This is where Harford's central argument comes in. He says that trial and error, experimentation, that's what's really important for success in a complex world that's always changing.
But hold on a second, isn't trial and error just a fancy way of saying winging it?
Not quite. Harford is very clear about the difference between random guessing and systematic experimentation. He talks about this really cool concept called the fitness landscape.
Fitness landscape. Sounds like something at the gym.
It's a visual metaphor. Picture a landscape with peaks and valleys. Each point on that landscape represents a different solution to a problem, and the higher the peak, the better that solution is.
Okay, I'm starting to see the picture. So you need to climb to the highest peak to find the best solution.
Exactly. But here's the thing. The landscape is always shifting. What works today might not work tomorrow. So you can't just get to the top and relax.
You have to keep moving, keep exploring, keep adapting.
Precisely. And that's where trial and error comes in. It's not about trying things randomly. It's about systematically exploring that landscape, testing things out, seeing what works best at that moment.
So it's like you're an explorer, constantly charting new territory.
That's a great way to put it. And this whole process, variation and selection, is super powerful. It's how evolution works, and it's how we can succeed in any field, whether it's business, science, or even art.
Okay, so trial and error. Got it. But here's the thing. Don't we all kind of hate making mistakes? It feels messy and risky.
You're absolutely right. We're naturally wired to avoid failure. We see in politics all the time. Politicians are terrified of looking like they're changing their minds,
It's like admitting they were wrong is a sign of weakness.
when it's often a sign of intelligence and adaptability. Being able to update your beliefs based on new information is crucial for making good decisions.
And it's not just politicians, right? We all feel it. Hartford uses this great example from the game show Deal or No Deal. Remember that?
With the briefcases of the money, yeah.
Researchers found that contestants who just missed out on a huge prize were much more likely to take big risks later, even if it wasn't rational.
So they doubled down on bad decisions because they were so afraid of losing again. It's really interesting how our emotions can lead us astray.
So how do we get over this fear of failure? How do we make it okay to experiment and make mistakes?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's something Harford explores in detail. He argues that we need to create systems and structures that actually encourage experimentation and make it safe to fail.
So instead of punishing people for making mistakes, we should reward them for learning from them.
Exactly. We need to shift our mindset. Instead of seeing failure as a setback, see it as a chance to grow.
It's about embracing the idea that we learn more from our mistakes than from our successes.
Absolutely. And this shift in mindset is important not just for individuals, but for organizations too.
Okay, so let's talk about a real-world example of this. Harford dives into the Iraq War, specifically the early stages when things weren't going so well. He uses it to show the limitations of traditional top-down decision-making.
He highlights the experience of H.R. McMaster, a military leader who actually wrote a book about leadership failure. He was in Iraq and saw how this rigid, centralized approach to warfighting just wasn't working.
It seems like the commanders were trying to impose a grand strategy from afar, but weren't adapting to the situation on the ground, which was constantly changing.
And the insurgents were incredibly adaptable. They weren't following the rule book. They were using these unconventional tactics and constantly changing their strategies.
So what did McMaster do?
He did something pretty radical. He basically defied orders. He saw the strategy wasn't working in his area, Tal Afar, so he started experimenting.
So he threw out the playbook and started trying new things.
Exactly. He realized the key to success in this chaotic environment was to empower the people on the ground, the ones closest to the problem.
Instead of trying to control everything from the top, he decentralized decision-making.
Precisely. He gave his troops the freedom to adapt to the local context, to try new things, and to learn from their mistakes.
And what was the result?
It was a huge success. By embracing adaptation and decentralization, he was able to win in Tal Afar, even though his approach went against the standard military thinking at the time.
It's amazing how empowering people to experiment and adapt can lead to such great outcomes, even in incredibly challenging situations.
And it's a lesson that can be applied to all kinds of organizations, not just the military.
So it seems like there's a pattern here. In complex situations, rigid plans often fail, and adapting is what wins the day.
Exactly. But how do we actually get better at adapting? How do we create a culture of experimentation?
That's the question, isn't it? How do we spark new ideas? Harford uses the story of the Spitfire fighter plane, which is a fascinating case study in innovation.
The Spitfire is such an iconic aircraft, especially its role in World War II. But what's really interesting is that it was born out of uncertainty.
The world was on the brink of war, and no one really knew what air combat would look like in the future.
So the British Air Ministry took a very different approach. Instead of trying to dictate every detail of the new fighter plane, they put out a call for designs that specifically encouraged innovation.
They're basically saying, show us what you got, we're open to anything.
Exactly. And this led to some groundbreaking designs, including the Spitfire. It was so different from the traditional biplanes of the time.
It was sleek, fast, and incredibly maneuverable. It really was a game changer.
And it highlights this key principle of adaptation. Sometimes knowing too much can actually hinder innovation.
It's like you're so focused on the right way of doing things that you can't see other possibilities, other ways of doing things differently.
Harford calls it the burden of knowledge. Too much expertise can sometimes blind you to new ideas.
It's like you're so busy looking at the trees that you completely miss the forest.
Exactly. If we want to be more adaptable, we have to challenge our own assumptions and be open to new ideas, even if they come from unexpected places.
And sometimes those unexpected sources can be the most innovative. Harford tells the incredible story of Mario Capecchi, a Nobel Prize-winning scientist who had a really remarkable journey.
His story is amazing. A real testament to the power of resilience. He was a street urchin in Italy during World War II, separated from his mother and struggling to survive. He faced so much hardship, but he never gave up on his dream of becoming a scientist.
It's hard to imagine what he went through, but he eventually made it to the United States, got an education, and became a leading geneticist.
And the research that eventually won him the Nobel Prize, it was initially rejected by funding agencies.
They thought it was too risky, too out there.
Exactly. But Capecchi kept at it, and he proved them wrong. His work changed our understanding of genetics and has had a huge impact on medicine and biotechnology.
It just shows you that the best ideas often come from unexpected places.
You can't always predict where the next big breakthrough will come from. Sometimes it's the underdogs, the people who challenge conventional wisdom and follow their passions, who make the biggest difference.
So if traditional ways of funding research don't always work, what are the alternatives? Harford looks at the history of prizes and how they can encourage those breakthrough moments.
The story of the Longitude Prize is a classic example. Back in the 18th century, figuring out longitude at sea was a huge problem. Ships were getting lost, running aground. It was a navigational nightmare.
So the British government basically said whoever can solve this problem gets a huge reward.
Right. They offered a prize worth millions in today's money. And it sparked incredible innovation. People from all walks of life, clockmakers, astronomers, even carpenters, tried to figure it out.
And who won?
A self-taught clockmaker named John Harrison. He spent decades perfecting these incredibly accurate marine chronometers.
Wow, that's persistence.
It just shows how prizes can attract solutions from unexpected places. They create a level playing field where anyone can compete, regardless of their background.
And the impact of the Longitude Prize was huge, not just for navigation, but for science and technology in general.
Absolutely. It spurred the development of new instruments, new techniques, new ways of thinking. And we see this same principle happening today with modern-day prizes like the X Prize, which is pushing innovation in spaceflight and other fields.
And then there are those really ambitious prizes, like the Gates Foundation's vaccine prizes, which are trying to develop vaccines for some of the world's deadliest diseases.
It's amazing to see how these prizes are tapping into human ingenuity and proving that we can achieve extraordinary things when we set ambitious goals and create the right incentives.
Okay, so we've talked about sparking innovation. But how do we know what actually works, especially when it comes to helping people escape poverty? Harford looks at development aid and makes a strong case for rigorous evaluation. He starts with the story of Muhammad Yunus and Grameen Bank.
Yunus is an interesting figure. He's considered the father of microfinance, and his work with Grameen Bank has helped millions of people out of poverty.
But even his most successful initiatives started with a lot of trial and error, right? He didn't just have this perfect plan from the beginning.
Exactly. He experimented, he adapted, he learned from his mistakes. And that's an important point about development aid. It's often portrayed as this top-down approach, but that often fails because it doesn't take into account the local context or the needs of the people it's supposed to help.
It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Exactly. And that's why rigorous evaluation is so important. Harford really emphasizes the need to be systematic about evaluating development programs, and he specifically highlights the importance of randomized controlled trials.
For those of us who aren't scientists, what are those? And why are they so important for this kind of work?
Imagine you're trying to figure out if a new medicine works. You wouldn't just give it to everyone and see what happens. You'd want to compare it to a group that didn't get the medicine. That's basically what randomized controlled trials do.
So it's about comparing apples to apples, making sure any differences you see are because of the program and not some other factor.
Exactly. Harford gives some great examples of how this has been used in development work, particularly in Kenya. One example is deworming pills for school kids. Researchers randomly assigned some schools to receive the pills, while others didn't. They found that the kids who got the pills had much better attendance and did better in school.
It seems so simple, but it had a huge impact.
It did. And this shows why rigorous evaluation is key. Without these trials, we might think a program is helpful, but we wouldn't have the evidence to back that up. And that evidence is crucial for making sure we're using resources effectively and making a real difference in people's lives.
It's about being accountable and making sure our efforts are truly helping people.
Absolutely. And it's worth noting that randomized controlled trials aren't a perfect solution. There are ethical considerations and practical challenges, but they're a valuable tool that can help us make more informed decisions about development aid.
Okay, so we've seen how those trials can help us evaluate specific programs. But what about bigger, more systemic issues? Harford talks about the importance of feedback loops, not just for individual projects, but for the entire process.
He quotes Owen Barter, who argues that feedback loops, not grand plans, are key to success. He gives a great example from Indonesia, where researchers were studying a road-building project.
So they were checking to see if the project was actually helping people.
Right, and they discovered that a lot of the materials meant for the roads were being stolen. The people running the project had no idea because they were so focused on the big picture of building roads that they weren't paying attention to what was happening on the ground.
So it was like they were building a road to nowhere.
In a way, yes. They were focused on the output, the road itself, not the outcome, the impact it was supposed to have. So they came up with this clever system where they got the local community involved in monitoring the project.
They basically deputized the locals to keep an eye on things.
They gave people cameras, and asked them to take pictures of anything suspicious. And this simple feedback loop made a huge difference. It stopped the theft, improved the roads, and made the project much more effective.
It's another example of how empowering people closest to the problem can lead to better results.
Exactly. They have the local knowledge that outsiders often lack. And this applies to all kinds of projects. We need systems that allow us to get feedback from the people we're trying to help, and then actually use that feedback to make adjustments as we go.
Okay, so feedback loops for building roads, but what about something like healthcare? Can they help there too?
Harford shares an example from Uganda, where researchers were studying community monitoring in healthcare clinics. They wanted to see if having local people oversee those clinics and give feedback would lead to better outcomes.
Did it work?
The results were pretty impressive. The clinics with community monitoring were much cleaner, the staff showed up for work more regularly, and fewer medicines were stolen.
It's like a neighborhood watch for healthcare.
Exactly. And it had a real impact on people's health care. Vaccination rates increased, and fewer children died. It's a great example of how feedback loops can improve healthcare by empowering local communities.
It seems like these loops are incredibly powerful, but how do we make sure they're effective, especially in something as complex as development aid? What are the key ingredients?
That's a great question. Harford emphasizes the importance of transparency, making information available to everyone involved. You can't have a feedback loop if people don't have the information they need to provide feedback.
It's like trying to play a game without knowing the rules.
Right. You need to know the goals, how the system works, and what the current status is. Then you need to be able to communicate your feedback effectively.
Which means creating a system where people feel safe speaking up and sharing their observations.
Absolutely. It's about fostering a culture of open communication and feedback. And then, just as importantly, it's about empowering people to act on that feedback. You don't just collect information, you use it to make changes.
And that requires a shift in thinking,
Yeah.
right? Moving away from that top-down, control-oriented approach to development and embracing a more decentralized, adaptive model.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that we don't have all the answers, and that the best solutions often come from the people who are closest to the problem. We need to create systems that allow those solutions to emerge.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about the importance of adaptation, the power of trial and error, the need for feedback loops. But what about those big, hairy problems that feel almost impossible to solve? Like climate change. Harford presents a fascinating paradox about this.
He argues that climate change is an incredibly complex problem, but it also has a relatively simple solution.
Wait, how is that possible? It seems like everyone's saying climate change is this giant issue that requires huge systemic change.
It is complex, but the solution, at least in theory, is straightforward. We need to put a price on carbon emissions. That creates a market-based incentive for people and businesses to reduce their carbon footprint.
Okay, but how does that work in practice? And why is it so hard to do?
Imagine if every time you drove your car, heated your home, or bought something made using fossil fuels, you had to pay a little extra. That extra cost would reflect the environmental damage caused by those emissions.
Like a sin tax on carbon.
You could think of it that way, but it's not about punishing people. It's about encouraging them to make more sustainable choices.
So if releasing carbon becomes more expensive, people will naturally find ways to release less. They'll buy more fuel-efficient cars, invest in renewable energy, things like that.
Exactly. And the great thing about a carbon price is that it doesn't require some central authority to control every little thing. It works through the market, guiding people and businesses toward more sustainable behavior.
So why is this so politically difficult? There seems to be a lot of resistance to this idea.
There are a few reasons. One is the perception that a carbon price would hurt poor people more because they spend a larger portion of their income on energy. But Harford argues that this is a misconception. There are ways to design carbon pricing to be fair and even beneficial for low-income households.
You could use the revenue from a carbon tax to fund programs that help those families switch to cleaner energy, or just provide direct financial assistance.
Exactly. And then there are the political challenges. The fossil fuel industry has a huge stake in keeping things the way they are, and they've been very effective at lobbying against climate action.
And let's not forget the misinformation campaigns and all the doubt they've sown in people's minds.
It's a prime example of how special interests can undermine the common good. But despite these challenges, there's growing momentum behind carbon pricing. More and more countries are implementing carbon taxes or cap-and-trade systems, and there's increasing recognition that this is the most effective way to tackle climate change.
It's a step in the right direction. Okay, so it seems like putting a price on carbon is a smart solution, but it's tough to implement politically. What else can we do? Hartford argues that individual actions, while important, are often not enough. He tells this funny story about a guy named Jeff who's trying to be environmentally conscious.
Jeff takes the bus, buys local produce, avoids plastic bags, all the things we're told to
He's
do.
doing all the right things.
He's trying to. But when Hartford actually analyzes it, he finds that Jeff's actions, while well-intentioned, don't really make much of a difference in his overall carbon footprint. And sometimes they might even be counterproductive.
Wait, really? So all that effort was for nothing. Why is that?
It's not that individual actions don't matter at all. It's that climate change is a systemic problem and needs systemic solutions. Our personal choices are just one small part of a much larger system that's largely beyond our control.
So it's like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teaspoon. You're doing something, but it's not going to solve the problem.
Exactly. We need to change the system itself. We need policies that encourage businesses to reduce emissions. We need to invest in renewable energy. We need countries to work together to address this global challenge.
So while reducing our personal carbon footprint is great, we can't fool ourselves into thinking that's enough. We need to push for those bigger, more structural solutions.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to the importance of adaptation. We have to be constantly experimenting, evaluating, and adjusting our approach to climate change because it's a complex, evolving problem, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
It sounds like humility is key, recognizing that we don't have all the answers and being willing to learn and adapt as we go.
That's exactly it. And that's a crucial mindset for tackling any complex challenge. Whether you're leading a team, running a business, or just trying to navigate life, embracing adaptation will make you more effective and resilient.
Okay, so we've seen how adaptation can help with climate change. But what about those unintended consequences? Sometimes our solutions can make things worse.
That's a really important point. Hartford uses the example of the Merton Rule in the UK to illustrate this.
The Merton Rule, what's that?
It was a building regulation meant to promote renewable energy. It required new buildings to generate a certain amount of their own energy from renewable sources, like solar panels.
Sounds like a good idea, trying to make buildings more sustainable.
In theory, yes. But it had a lot of unintended consequences. The rule was so focused on renewable energy generation that it didn't consider the broader context or the downsides of some of those technologies.
So did people just start slapping solar panels on everything, whether it made sense or not?
Pretty much. And it led to some absurd situations. Hartford talks about this huge office building in London that had to install a massive wood-burning boiler to meet the rule. But getting all the wood to that boiler was a logistical nightmare.
So they're trucking in wood from all over, creating traffic, noise, and probably even more carbon emissions.
Exactly. It's a classic example of a well-intentioned policy backfiring because it didn't consider the full picture.
So it's not enough to just have a good idea. You have to think about how it will actually work, the logistics, the unintended consequences.
Right. And this goes back to a deeper principle that Hartford explores. He calls it economic bulldogs.
Economic bulldogs. Okay, now I'm really intrigued.
He uses the example of how bulldogs are bred to illustrate how our attempts to control and optimize things can sometimes backfire.
Okay, I'm not seeing the connection yet. What do bulldogs have to do with economics?
Well, bulldogs have been bred over centuries to have certain features. The short noses, bowed legs, wrinkly faces. But those features, while some people find them cute, have also caused a lot of health problems for the dogs.
They have breathing problems, they can't reproduce naturally, they're prone to all sorts of ailments.
Exactly. And that's because breeders focus so much on achieving a specific look that they accidentally created a breed that's inherently unhealthy.
So how does that relate to economics?
Hartford argues that we do the same thing in economics. We try to control and optimize systems without fully understanding how all the pieces fit together. We design the perfect policy or regulation, but we often end up creating these economic bulldogs.
Policies that look good on paper but end up causing problems?
Exactly. He gives the example of fuel efficiency standards for cars in the U.S. While well-intentioned, they've actually led to more traffic deaths because they've encouraged car manufacturers to make lighter cars that aren't as safe in a crash.
So it's a trade-off. We solved one problem but created another.
Right. And this highlights the danger of trying to outsmart evolution, whether it's biological evolution or the evolution of economic systems. These complex systems adapt to our interventions, often in ways we don't expect.
So it's not that we shouldn't try to make things better, it's that we need to be aware of those potential unintended consequences and be willing to adapt our approach.
Precisely. We need to be more like gardeners than engineers. Gardeners create the conditions for things to grow and then let nature do its thing. They don't try to micromanage every detail.
That's a great analogy. So if we want to create more adaptable organizations and systems, what can we learn from nature? Harford looks at biology and how evolution has solved complex problems over millions of years.
He starts by talking about decentralization. Nature doesn't have a central planner. It relies on distributed intelligence, with individuals and species making decisions based on their local environment.
Like a giant self-organizing network.
Exactly. And this decentralized approach is incredibly resilient. It lets systems adapt to change and evolve over time, and there's no single point of failure.
How do we apply this to organizations? How do we make them more decentralized and adaptable?
Harvard shares some great examples of companies that have done just that. One is Timpson, a chain of shoe repair and key cutting shops in the UK. They've got this radically decentralized structure where they give employees tons of autonomy. Each shop is basically run like a small business.
Wow, so the employees are almost like entrepreneurs.
Exactly. They're in charge of hiring, firing, setting prices, all of it. They can do what they think is best for their shop without having to ask permission from headquarters.
That's a lot of trust. How do they make sure everyone's on the same page?
They have a very strong culture of transparency and accountability. They share information openly and track performance closely. They also have peer monitoring, so employees hold each other accountable.
So it's not just about giving people freedom, it's about having the right systems in place to support that freedom.
Absolutely. And it's about having clear values and principles that guide decision-making at every level. So everyone knows what the company stands for and can make decisions that are aligned with those values.
So we've got Timpson as an example of decentralization. Are there other companies that have done similar things?
Hartford also talks about Whole Foods Market. They've also adopted a decentralized structure, giving their teams a lot of autonomy.
It's like Timpson, but for groceries.
Exactly. And they've been very successful. They consistently do better than their competitors, and their employees are known for being really passionate about their work.
What can we learn from companies like Timpson and Whole Foods? What are the keys to creating more adaptive organizations?
There are a few key takeaways. First, empower people on the front lines. Give them the authority to make decisions and solve problems.
Don't micromanage.
Right. Second, create that culture of transparency and accountability. Share information openly and track performance. This lets everyone see what's working and creates a sense of ownership.
Everyone's in the loop.
Exactly. Third, encourage experimentation and learning. Make it safe for people to try new things and make mistakes. Don't punish failure. Celebrate it as a chance to learn.
So it's okay to fail as long as you learn from it.
Exactly. And finally, have those clear values and principles to guide decision-making at every level. This provides a framework for making those decentralized decisions and make sure everyone's working toward the same goals.
So it's about structure and culture.
Absolutely. It's about creating an environment where people feel empowered and supported to do their best work.
Okay, so we've talked about decentralization. Are there any other lessons from biology that we can apply to organizations?
Hartford also points out the importance of redundancy. In biology, redundancy means having backups, like extra copies of a gene or an organ. This provides a safety net in case one copy fails.
It's like having a spare tire.
Right. This is important in organizations, too. We need backup systems and processes so that if one part fails, the whole thing doesn't collapse.
Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. This is especially important in complex systems like the financial system, where one failure can have a domino effect and cause a total meltdown if there are no backups.
Okay, so decentralization and redundancy. Anything else?
Diversity is also crucial. In biology, a diverse ecosystem is more resilient and more likely to thrive. A monoculture is much more vulnerable.
If a disease comes along that targets one specific crop or species, the whole ecosystem could collapse.
Exactly. The same principle applies to organizations. We need diverse perspectives, backgrounds, and experiences to make good decisions and adapt to change. A company where everyone thinks alike and has the same background is much more likely to get stuck in a rut.
So it's about building a team with different strengths and viewpoints.
Absolutely. Diversity is not just a nice to have, it's essential for success. And it's something we need to be intentional about. We need to build a culture that values and embraces diversity.
I completely agree. So we've talked about creating more adaptive organizations, but what about us as individuals? How can we become more adaptable? Harford shares the story of Twyla Tharp.
Twyla Tharp, the choreographer. Twyla Tharp, the choreographer.
She's a legend in the dance world, and she has this incredible approach to creativity and adaptation. She talks about creating a safe space for experimentation in her work.
That makes total sense. If you want to be truly innovative, you can't be afraid to try new things and maybe fail, you know? And sometimes fail big.
Right. You're stuck without that freedom to experiment, without the willingness to make those mistakes.
Totally.
Hmm.
And it can be hard to create that kind of environment, a space where it's okay to be wrong, especially in those traditional organizations where there's so much pressure to just conform and not take risks.
It's like everyone's walking on eggshells.
Yeah.
So how do we create those safe spaces? What can we learn from Twyla Tharp?
She talks about having a routine, a structure that allows her to experiment within certain boundaries. So it's not about just chaos, but a disciplined way of exploring.
So it's like having guidelines, but within those guidelines, you have the freedom to play around, to experiment.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. She also talks about collaborating, working with other dancers to bounce ideas around and get feedback.
So it's not about being a lone genius working in isolation. It's about having a community that supports you and pushes you.
Exactly. And she also emphasizes detaching yourself from the work, being able to step back and evaluate it objectively.
So you don't get too emotionally attached to your ideas and you
Yeah.
can let go if something isn't working.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that failure is part of the creative process, that the path to success is rarely a straight line.
I love that. So how can we apply this to our own lives? Most of us aren't choreographers working with dancers.
The principles are the same, though. Whether it's a new hobby, starting a side hustle, or even just having a tough conversation, you can approach it with that same spirit of curiosity and willingness to learn from mistakes.
It's about giving ourselves permission to try and fail and then try again.
Exactly. And it's about surrounding ourselves with people who will support us, challenge us, and help us see things in new ways.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about how to make systems more resilient, especially after what happened with the 2008 financial crisis. Harford really gets into what went wrong and what we can learn from it.
That's a huge topic.
Uh-huh.
Financial crises have such devastating consequences, and it seems like they happen so often.
It's like we don't learn from our mistakes. We keep repeating them.
Exactly. Harford argues that one of the big issues is that our financial system is so complex and interconnected. He compares it to dominoes. If one falls, it can trigger a cascade that brings the whole system down.
So it's not just one bank or one company failing. It's about how those failures can spread throughout the whole system.
Exactly. So how do we prevent those cascades? How do we make the system stronger so that one failure doesn't lead to a complete collapse?
That's the big question, right?
It is. And Harford explores different approaches. One is to make the dominoes smaller. This means breaking up those big banks and institutions so that if one fails, it doesn't take everything else down with it.
So instead of one massive fire, you have lots of smaller, more contained ones.
Right. Another idea is to create fire breaks between the dominoes. This means putting regulations in place that limit how connected everything is, so there's less risk of that contagion effect.
So if one bank gets in trouble, it doesn't automatically spread to other banks.
Exactly. And the third approach is to make the dominoes themselves stronger. This means requiring banks to have more capital reserves so they can withstand losses better.
So they've got more cushion to absorb those shocks, and they're less likely to fall over in the first place.
Exactly. We've seen some of these approaches since the 2008 crisis, but there's always this balance between making the system more resilient and making sure it's still efficient and dynamic.
Because if you have too many rules, it can stifle innovation and make it harder for businesses to operate.
Right? Finding that balance is key. Making the system safer without bogging it down with too much regulation.
So we've talked about the system as a whole, but what about the people working within it? How do we encourage more responsible behavior and less recklessness in finance?
That brings us to the culture of the industry. Harford talks about this fixation on short-term profits and bonuses. It creates a culture where taking risks is rewarded, and recklessness is often just accepted.
It's all about the quick win, no matter the consequences.
Right. And this creates this moral hazard. If you make a risky bet that pays off, you get a huge bonus. But if it goes wrong, someone else is left to deal with the mess.
So how do we change that culture? It feels pretty ingrained.
It's a tough one. Harford has a few suggestions. One is to change how bonuses work. Instead of rewarding short-term gains, reward long-term performance. That way, people are thinking about the long-term impact of their decisions.
So you don't get your bonus for 5 or 10 years after you've seen how those decisions really played out.
Exactly. Another idea is to increase transparency. If everyone can see how decisions are made and what risks are involved, there's less chance that reckless behavior will go unnoticed.
It's about bringing those things out into the open.
Right. And a third suggestion is to foster a culture of ethics and responsibility.
Oh.
This means getting people in the industry to think about the consequences of their actions, not just for themselves, but for everyone.
So it's not just about profit, it's about acting with integrity and considering the wider impact of your decisions.
Absolutely. It's about moving away from that greed is good mentality and recognizing that we all have a responsibility to act in a way that benefits society.
Okay, let's look at a specific example of how things can go wrong. Harford tells the story of Lehman Brothers collapsing, a real turning point in the 2008 crisis.
Lehman Brothers was huge, one of the oldest, most prestigious names on Wall Street. And when it went under, it sent shockwaves through the entire financial system. It was a wake-up call for everyone, a sign that this was a serious crisis.
Like the canary in the coal mine.
Exactly. Harford explains how it happened. They took on too much risk, investing in these complex financial instruments that they didn't fully understand.
It sounds like they were building a house of cards. Impressive from a distance, but incredibly fragile.
That's a good analogy. When the housing bubble burst, their bets went bad and they quickly ran out of money. They were over-leveraged and had no one to absorb those losses.
Could it have been prevented? Could they have been saved?
Harford looks into this. He talks about how the government was reluctant to bail them out because they didn't want to set a precedent of rescuing banks that failed. They were worried it would encourage more risk-taking.
So it's that moral hazard again?
Yeah. But in the end, Lehman's collapse was so damaging that the government had no choice but to bail out other banks to prevent a complete financial meltdown.
A real lose-lose situation.
Absolutely. It shows just how hard these decisions are for policymakers. There are no easy answers.
Beyond the collapse of Lehman Brothers, what are the broader lessons from this crisis?
Harford argues that it reveals some fundamental flaws in how we think about risk and how we regulate finance. He talks about how we tend to underestimate the possibility of those rare, extreme events, what Nassim Taleb calls black swans.
Those events that come out of nowhere and take us by surprise but have a huge impact.
Exactly. We often assume the future will be like the past, so we base decisions on historical data. But that can be very dangerous in complex systems because those rare events can completely disrupt things.
So we have to be more humble in our approach to risk and regulation. Recognize that we can't predict everything and build systems that can handle unexpected shocks.
Exactly. We need to be more prepared for the unexpected, build in redundancy and flexibility so we can adapt.
So a bit of humility and uncertainty is key to building resilience.
I think that's right. And this applies to everything, not just finance.
So how do we prevent these crises from happening again? What can we learn from 2008 to avoid repeating those mistakes?
Harford thinks we need to change how we regulate finance. He says that traditional regulation has focused too much on rules and compliance, this sort of checklist approach to risk.
So tick all the boxes and you're good.
Right. But that doesn't really work because it can't keep up with how quickly the financial system changes and how complex it is.
Trying to catch water in a sieve.
Exactly. That's why Harford suggests moving towards a more principles-based approach. This means setting broader guidelines and letting regulators use their judgment to apply those guidelines to different situations.
So it's less about the letter of the law and more about its spirit, understanding the intent and adapting it to the specific circumstances.
Exactly. It gives regulators the flexibility to adapt because the financial system is always changing and can't be perfectly controlled by these rigid rules.
It's more about having those smart, adaptable regulators than trying to write a rule book for every possible scenario.
Exactly. But this requires a shift in thinking, both within the financial industry and the regulatory bodies. It also requires rebuilding trust. Trust in regulators to make good decisions, trust in banks to act responsibly, and trust that the system itself can be made more resilient.
That trust is definitely lacking these days, so rebuilding it is crucial for a financial system that works for everyone.
Absolutely. Okay, let's dive into some specific ideas for reform. Harford talks about narrow banking.
Narrow banking, I've never heard of that.
It's about separating those basic banking functions, like taking deposits and making loans, from the more risky investment activities.
So separating the everyday banking that most people use from the high-stakes stuff that can lead to those meltdowns.
Exactly. The basic banking side would have lots of regulations and be backed by the government. The riskier investment activities wouldn't have that same level of protection.
So if those risky activities go south, they don't take the whole system down and need a taxpayer bailout. It's like a firewall between the essential banking services and the more speculative stuff.
Exactly. This way, we could still have a dynamic financial system without putting taxpayers at risk.
Sounds great in theory, but is it realistic? Could we actually make this happen? given how powerful the financial industry is.
It would be a huge change, for sure, and there would be pushback. But it's worth exploring, especially given what we went through in 2008.
Okay, so narrow banking is one option. What other reforms does Hartford discuss?
He talks about the need for more transparency. To prevent future crises, everyone needs to see what's going on in the system, not just a few insiders.
No more hiding things.
Yeah,
No more complicated transactions that no one understands.
exactly. We need to be able to see where the money is going and understand the risks that are being taken, not just by individual banks, but by the system as a whole.
That means better data collection, more comprehensive analysis, and a willingness to share that information publicly.
It does.
Hmm.
And it requires a change in culture, moving from secrecy to openness and accountability.
So that anyone can see potential problems and hold the industry accountable.
Right. Transparency is crucial for accountability, and accountability is essential for a system that works.
What else can we do to reform the system and prevent those crises?
Hartford is a big advocate for empowering whistleblowers. People who see wrongdoing need to be able to speak up without fear of retaliation.
Because right now it often seems like they're punished for doing the right thing.
That's right. And we've seen what happens when whistleblowers are silenced. Things go wrong, risks are ignored, and everyone suffers in the end.
So we need a culture where speaking up is encouraged, where whistleblowers are the heroes, not the villains.
Exactly. We need to make it clear that speaking truth to power is a good thing, not something to be punished.
Okay, so we've got a more resilient system, regulatory reform, and empowered whistleblowers. What about the human element? How do we encourage more ethical behavior in finance?
Here's where Hartford brings it all back to adaptation. He suggests we need to build a culture of learning and experimentation in the industry, a culture where mistakes are okay as long as you learn from them.
So it's not about being perfect, it's about being willing to try new things, experiment, take risks, and learn from those inevitable failures.
Exactly. It's about always being on the lookout for potential problems, adapting to new situations, instead of stubbornly sticking to a plan that's no longer working.
Like being a detective, always looking for clues and trying to stay one step ahead.
That's a great way to think about it. And it also means having the humility to admit when you're wrong and change direction, even if it's tough.
So it's not just about systems and regulations, it's about mindset. A mindset of adaptation, experimentation, and humility.
Absolutely. Creating a culture where learning and adapting are valued, not punished.
Okay, we've covered so much ground in this deep dive. But before we wrap up, there's one more thing Hartford talks about that I want to touch on. The importance of play.
Play, like having fun.
Exactly. Hartford argues that play is crucial for creativity and innovation, and that it can actually help us become more adaptable.
Because when we play, we're not afraid to try new things.
Mm-hmm.
We don't worry about failing, so we're more likely to come up with creative solutions.
It's like when we were kids, we learned through playing. We weren't afraid of making mistakes because we saw them as part of learning and growing.
Exactly. And that's the mindset we need to rediscover if we want to be more adaptable and innovative.
Yeah.
Create a space where it's safe to play, to experiment, and to fail forward.
Fail forward. I love that. It's a great reminder that failure isn't the opposite of success. It's part of the journey.
Exactly. And it's about not taking ourselves too seriously, allowing ourselves to have fun and be more playful in how we approach work and life.
Okay, as we wrap up our deep dive into adapt, what are the key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, there are a few important things to remember. First, the world is complex and unpredictable. We need to be humble about our ability to predict and control things. We need to build systems that can withstand those unexpected shocks.
And second, we have to embrace trial and error. Experimentation is how we make progress. Learn from those mistakes because failure is just a stepping stone on the path to success.
Third, feedback is essential. We need to build systems that allow us to see what's working and what's not, and then adjust course accordingly. We need to listen to the people who are closest to the problem and use their insights.
Fourth, we have to be mindful of those unintended consequences. Our solutions can sometimes create new problems, so we have to be vigilant and adapt as needed.
And finally, we need to create those safe spaces for experimentation, both for ourselves and for our organizations, fostering a culture of safety, diversity, and purpose where people feel empowered to speak their minds, share ideas, and experiment without fear.
So ultimately, the key takeaway is to embrace adaptation. It's how we navigate this uncertain world, solve complex problems, and build more resilient and fulfilling lives.
I couldn't have said it better myself. It's about recognizing that the world is constantly changing and that our ability to adapt is what allows us to not just survive, but thrive.
And I think what's so powerful about Hartford's message is that it's not just about fixing what's broken. It's about always trying to improve, to evolve, to become better versions of ourselves.
Absolutely. It's about seeing the world as this dynamic, ever-changing thing and realizing that adaptation is how we thrive, not just survive.
So as you go about your week, think about an area in your life where you've been resisting change. Maybe a habit you want to break, a project you've been putting off, or a relationship that needs work.
Instead of avoiding that discomfort, what if you saw it as a chance to grow? What if you created a space to try new things, to experiment, to fail forward?
Fail forward. What a great concept. It reminds us that failure isn't the end, it's just a part of the journey.
It's the price we pay for a more adaptable and ultimately more fulfilling life.
And on that note, we'll leave you to consider that challenge, to embrace a little more adaptation in your own life. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
So, thinking back to what we were discussing earlier about expertise and how we sometimes get stuck in our ways, Harford actually shares this really fascinating story about a guy named Jeff who's trying super hard to be eco-conscious.
Oh, yeah. What was his deal? I vaguely remember that. Wasn't he like super into recycling and all that?
He was. He was taking the bus, buying local produce, refusing plastic bags, all the things you're supposed to do.
Sounds like he was doing everything right.
He was definitely trying to. But then Harford actually crunches the numbers and finds that Jeff's actions, while well-intentioned, barely make a dent in his overall carbon footprint.
Wait, seriously, so all that effort was basically for nothing?
It's not that his actions were pointless. It's more that climate change is this massive systemic problem. And individual actions, while important, can only do so much. It's like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon.
Okay, so what's the solution then? If individual efforts aren't enough to make a real difference?
Well, this is where those systemic solutions come in. Things like carbon pricing, investing in renewable energy, and global cooperation. Those are the levers that can really shift the needle.
So it's about those big structural changes rather than just individual actions.
Right. It's not about telling people to stop caring or doing their part, but about recognizing that we need those bigger, more impactful solutions to truly address the problem.
That makes sense. So we've got to focus on changing the system itself, not just our individual behavior within the system.
Exactly. And that's a pretty powerful insight because it applies to so many other areas of life, too. Think about healthcare, education, even just the way we design cities. These are all complex systems that require systemic solutions.
So this idea of adaptation isn't just about climate change, it's about how we approach all sorts of complex problems.
Absolutely. It's a fundamental shift in thinking. Moving away from this idea that we can control and manage everything perfectly, and embracing a more humble approach that acknowledges uncertainty and complexity.
So it's about being adaptable, not just in our actions, but in our thinking, too.
Exactly. Being able to adjust our mental models, our assumptions, and our expectations, that's a crucial part of becoming truly adaptable.
Okay, so let's zoom out a bit and think about how we can apply this idea of adaptation to our own lives. What can we do to become more adaptable in a practical sense?
Well, I think a lot of it comes back to mindset, being open to new experiences, new perspectives, new ways of doing things.
So it's about getting out of our comfort zones and challenging ourselves.
Yes. And it's also about embracing failure as a learning opportunity. Not being afraid to make mistakes, but actually seeing them as a chance to grow.
That fail forward idea we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Failure is inevitable, but it's how we respond to it that really matters.
So it's about having that growth mindset, being open to feedback, and always striving to learn and improve.
I think that's a great way to put it. And I think it's also about building resilience, developing those coping mechanisms and support systems that can help us navigate challenges and setbacks.
Because life is full of those unexpected twists and turns, right? It's not always going to be smooth sailing.
Exactly. And the more adaptable we are, the better equipped we'll be to handle those bumps in the road and come out stronger on the other side.
I love that. So as we wrap up this deep dive into adapt, why success always starts with failure, I think the big takeaway is that adaptation isn't just a strategy, it's a way of life.
I completely agree. It's about recognizing that change is constant and that our ability to adapt is what allows us to not just survive, but to thrive, to grow, to learn, and to become the best versions of ourselves.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll leave you with this. Embrace the power of adaptation. Experiment, learn, and fail forward. You might be surprised at what you can achieve when you let go of the need to be perfect and embrace the journey of becoming.
I love that. Embrace the journey. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into adaptation.